We're living in an age of chaos, with politicians predicting World War III, pandemics, economic chaos, and social unrest in many Western countries. We've seen black swan events in recent years, and while we can't prepare for them, we should prepare for not being able to prepare for them. So what exactly is a black swan event? It all started in this book called The Black Swan. It's by Nassim Taleb, and it talks about these so-called events that are highly unlikely to happen, but would have severe consequences if they did. They have severe repercussions, and yet they cannot be predicted well in advance. So think something like the COVID pandemic. I remember celebrating New Year's Eve as we rolled into 2020, and we were discussing all of our plans for the year, and it wasn't very long after that date that I was in Asia watching this pandemic unfold, and nobody really knew what to expect. Things just kind of came to a halt. After a time of paralysis, more and more people started calling Nomad Capitalists because they were worried, like, I can't travel anymore. Like, what do I do? Like, I need a second passport. Like, my government is not giving me the freedom that I would expect. Like, I need some options. Black swan events cannot be predicted in advance. They are catastrophic and have a catastrophic impact on the global economy or the global order. And even science, logic, and astrology fail to predict them. One of the stories that's talked about for black swan events is the story of a turkey that maybe naturally isn't sure what to think about humans, has a fear of humans, but the human comes in, the human starts feeding the turkey and taking care of the turkey, and the turkey's like, okay, I can trust humans. And then, American Thanksgiving comes around, and the turkey meets its end. And the idea is that there's this sense of calm, and I think this really is more true in countries that haven't had a breakdown in order, that haven't experienced chaos. Obviously, there's places on Earth that continue to experience chaos. There's places that have come out of chaos in the last, 25 and 30 years that have kind of learned from that. It's kind of still in their DNA to avoid that. But the place where I'm from and the place where maybe you're from, it's just like, hey, things might get worse and things aren't heading in the right direction, but this is still the best place to live in the world. To me, kind of sounds like the turkey. So today I'm going to walk you through 7 black swan events that you might want to prepare for, and I want you to leave a comment below with additional ones that you think I'm missing. The first things that come to my mind are war. You're seeing politicians now talking about what's going to happen in World War III. You saw some majority of Americans concerned about a possible doomsday event. And there are all different kinds of events that were listed, from aliens, invasions, zombie apocalypse, but other things that could happen, including World War III, nuclear issues. The word nuclear is being discussed a lot more when you look at the West's role in the war in Ukraine. And so war could be a physical issue. If you're living somewhere and something bad happens, you might have some physical fallout. You may be drafted in to serve in the wars we've seen in places like Ukraine and in Russia. Or your children may be drafted in to serve at the war, and who knows how bad it is. I was going back through the stats on World War II the other day, and it's amazing the number of people who died during World War II. But your country may also be pegged as some kind of geopolitical enemy. Let's say you have a business and you're following my advice and your business is going to be more international. There may be certain countries where you can't do business, or you're not allowed to invest in things that are growing. Jim Rogers came to Nomad Capitalist Live and said there's certain places that because he's an American, he's not allowed to invest, and those could be some of the most profitable places out there. And if nothing else, you may just lose options during a war to go somewhere else. And so we saw this during the pandemic, but if there's a war, like you want to get away from that war, what if you are in North America and you want to go somewhere in South America, like Uruguay, that's just kind of, or Paraguay, that's just kind of, away from it all? Are they going to be like, hey, we don't want people with your passport anymore? It seems more unlikely for a US or Canadian passport, but what if some crazy stuff is happening? Even if you retain technical visa-free access to go somewhere safer, if you don't have a residence permit or a second citizenship, they could just do what they do to people from Venezuela. Yeah, technically you can come and visit, but we're going to really put you through the ringer. And so you may have a difficult time getting out in the event of war, and they may not let you get out. There are financial issues in the sense of a currency collapse, right? Bankruptcy happens very slowly and then all at once. And I think that could apply to a currency collapse. If you look at some of the charts of currencies historically, and even this century, just big dramatic drops due to events that often the average person wouldn't have predicted. One thing that's talked about in the Black Swan is, there may be people behind the scenes almost kind of pulling the strings, it seems like they meant to say. But if you're not aware of it, right, somebody might kind of see, oh, this might be coming, but the average person is not going to be aware of it. And that is what makes it a Black Swan event. The idea that the dollar is just going to collapse overnight or the pound is going to collapse overnight, I mean, it has happened with some major currencies before, but it seems not so likely. And so you think, well, why don't I just keep my money in dollars? Why don't I just keep my money in euros? Those currencies certainly have seen marginal, devaluations in terms of their reserve status. In fact, on top of the fact that just inflation in some of these countries, in particular places like the UK, has just been incredible. And so a currency collapse is something that could happen as well. Even if your currency doesn't collapse, what about freezing of bank accounts? I don't think anybody in Canada expected this to happen in 2022 when, hey, they donated some money in solidarity with a cause. Whether you like that cause or not, the idea that their bank accounts were frozen gives a chilling effect to what governments will do when they think they can get away with it. And maybe the governments don't think they can go full on with that yet, but basically calling people who, give money to a cause within their own country terrorists seems a little extreme and seems to stifle dissent, which is kind of a Black Swan event on its own if it were to happen all at once, this kind of stifling of dissent. So your bank accounts can be frozen because you gave money to the wrong cause or because you went to the wrong place. We're seeing now the United States. If you are from Europe and you took a vacation to Cuba, you're like persona non grata now. You've got to go and apply for a visa at the U.S. Embassy, even if your passport doesn't generally require it. You've got to explain, like, why did you go to Cuba on a holiday? And so freezing of bank accounts, I would say even number 4, stifling of dissent. But what about one that we've all seen in recent years? What about lockdowns? It could be for the next pandemic. You've seen, oh, there's a new variant now. Do we need more lockdowns? People have to go back to wearing masks. What about the climate lockdown? What about whatever lockdown? It worked the first time, and people like to go on comment sections and say, just don't comply, we'll never do it again. I mean, the average person is going to comply. Why some of these events actually come to fruition and unfold the way that they do is because the average person just kind of goes along and does what they're told. And so more lockdowns would certainly be some kind of Black Swan event. And yet it's interesting that during the pandemic, that word meant different things in different countries. There were countries where it meant like you were really like stay in your capsule, even if you're living somewhere in Asia, and that's all the house you have. And there were places where it's like, hey, go out and play and just, don't, cause too much of a mess. If you think Florida was the first place in the world to reopen, you're wrong. But more lockdowns certainly could come. And, if it works once, why not do it again? Play the hits, as they say. We could also look at travel restrictions. That's not so much a Black Swan event in and of itself, but what could happen to cause that? Again, I think that's some kind of dissent. What if there's some unimaginable level of kind of civil dissent? Or, in the United States now, where there's people just keep talking about a civil war coming. Is that really going to happen? I don't know. But, is there ever a time when countries' geopolitical relations break down and your country isn't deemed wealthy enough, strong enough, desirable enough to where you can come there? Obviously, I'm a big believer that if times get tough, there's a geographical solution to every problem. And if I'm living in a country that has war or there's crazy lockdowns or, they're trying to, take my money or the inflation's going through the roof or the currency's not doing well, I'm going to try and go somewhere where I'm safer. Now, obviously, I'm going to set up infrastructure to begin with, where even before that happens, hey, maybe I hold different currencies and I hold it in banks around the world. And maybe I have some gold stored in vaults outside my country so they can't come and just take it from me at my door. And maybe if I have a crypto hard wallet, maybe I'll keep something at home, but maybe I'm also going to keep some in a private safe deposit box somewhere else. So the travel restrictions themselves may not be the actual Black Swan event, but who knows when there's the next, again, pandemic or whatever reason why you can't go somewhere. And we've seen this geopolitically. As the world's becoming more multipolar, you're going to see more countries even telling citizens of big Western countries, yeah, we don't want you. We've seen it, with Turkey, for example, had a spat with the U.S., don't come. It was actually, you can't come. It wasn't go get a visa. And you might say, well, who cares about going to Turkey? But if there's crazy stuff going on in the world, I want to have as many options as possible. I mean, just as one example, Turkey's a place that airport was open for almost the entirety of the pandemic, more than a lot of the other airports in Europe. When I was traveling around during the pandemic, I really said, let's not fly through airports in the EU. Let's fly through places like Istanbul where it was open. And so if you had a situation where much of the world was shut down and restrictions were higher somewhere else, being able to fly from pretty much anywhere in the world to Istanbul and have a place where things were not as strict is maybe not a bad thing. And so having access to travel as many places as possible is a good thing. But I think that part of that black swan event potentially could be some geopolitical issue. It could be a war, could be some great diplomatic event, some breakdown. But if you think that all this BRIC stuff and all these different groups around the world who are trying to band together and kind of be a separate force from the West, if they're doing that and they don't have a plan to kind of keep people out, those may be some of the places that you want to go when all the places that the US or your country agree with in the West are all doing the exact same thing. Different countries function differently. The US and Canada probably function pretty much the same, and they kind of acted largely the same. Maybe Canada was more strict during the pandemic, but the way that US versus somewhere an island in the middle of the ocean may have been a different response. Another thing that could be a black swan event for some group of people is we're just going to take your passport. And that could fall under travel restrictions, but hey, we can't issue you a passport. You're stuck here. Or we're not giving you a passport because we don't like you because you gave to the wrong cause, or your social credit score is not high enough. You're stuck where you are. And it's been bandied around by Boris Johnson in the UK. If you have some misdemeanor that you were accused of, maybe we shouldn't give you a passport. Like the idea that Justin Trudeau said, if you're giving to a cause that the government doesn't agree with, hey, maybe you'll get a criminal conviction and then you can't travel to the US. This way of kind of not having travel restrictions on a macro level, but keeping you from traveling is a way of stifling dissent, confiscating your passport. They already can do that for numerous reasons. You don't pay your child support, you don't pay your taxes. Hey, you should do those things if you're required to do so. If you don't want to pay so much in taxes, you can move somewhere else. But how do they stop you from moving? How do they stop you from being able to travel? Well, for one thing, I was getting my passport renewed in one day in some countries during the pandemic. And I heard people in the US and Canada and elsewhere, it took 6, 9, 12 months sometimes. That's how they stop you, because you weren't prepared. You didn't have your passport ready. And maybe that passport didn't let you into as many places as it used to during a black swan event. And I think at the end of that, people are going to be upset. And so I think the big financial one for me is, do you have citizenship-based taxation? Do you have a wealth tax? I'm not sure if those are big black swan events, but I think that they're perhaps the effect of a black swan event where nobody really thought that if you were a US citizen, that you would have to work so hard to have such a basic income these days. And I have some sympathy for that. Obviously, I want everyone around the world to rise. And so, in our company, we hire people around the world because we, like supporting people in different parts of the world. I don't think it was that long ago that it would have been seen as a black swan event playing out in slow motion, that you're born, or I'm born in Ohio, and you just can't go get a job at the Ford plant, make really good money, and have a nice house, and have a couple of cars, and just be able to chill and relax and raise a family. That's not how it works anymore. That is a slow motion black swan event that those countries around the world that perhaps a lot of people write off as the antidote to some of these things happening, like where they're going to want to go when this stuff happens. Those countries that have been gaining, the countries where people are actually optimistic, where they're proud, where they're feeling like, yeah, we have jobs coming in, we're making more money, we have disposable income, we're building a middle class. It happened in Asia, now it's happening in Africa, where they're building a middle class in a number of those countries. Those people are more optimistic. And I think that in many cases, they don't trust the government nearly as much, to where they don't want to go back to some of this stuff, and they're going to push back on the response to some black swan events. Obviously a virus, for example, or let me give you one more black swan event, some kind of food shortage. Look at during the pandemic. There were places in the West, there was a food shortage. And these politicians, they can't get out of their own way. There's ways they can, bring in more wheat, bring in more this, make it easier. No, they won't even ease up some of the restrictions to make it easier so I actually think a food shortage could be something that would happen. And so you want to be prepared for that. Having some land somewhere else is a form of asset protection, diversification, get a free residence permit in the process, be able to go there and grow my own food wouldn't be the worst thing. The slowest motion is just how the world has progressed in terms of some countries really just having a lot more optimism and the West really not so much. The worst way in my mind to plan against these black swan events is the following. You talk about them. You pretend that you're really concerned. Yeah, there's a war coming. It could be terrible. And that you're really smart. Then you do essentially nothing. And so I can't predict what happens. I think some of these more extreme things, zombie apocalypse, I'm not putting my money on that one. I will tell you, it's hard for me to connect with some of this stuff because during the pandemic, for example, I traveled around to different countries and I feel like really kind of timed it properly to where I had a very open and nice and comfortable life and never even got sick. And so it's hard for me to imagine some of this stuff because when I was in Malaysia, there was no food shortage. We'd go to the grocery store every day. And it was brimming with stuff. In the early days, I'm like, let's stock up as much as possible. Let's fill the pantries with beans and stuff like that. And then they just kept replacing it. I didn't really even feel that badly about it because it was always replaced the next day. There was no food shortage. And then you'd see in the U.S. there was one. So for me, like not seeing so many of these things, I read about it. And yet being diversified, I feel more insulated. What Nomad Capitalist can do is walk you through all the options. We all have some of these that we're more concerned about than others. And if you live in the United States, your issue might not be that you're fearing a currency collapse. I can tell you that yes, I don't think that the dollar is just going off a cliff tomorrow. It has gone off a cliff, again, in slow motion, and it continues to lose its influence every year, which I think geopolitically perhaps contributes to some crazy stuff happening in the world because every year it loses a little bit of its share as the reserve currency that eats away at American political power. I mean, eventually something could come from that. But who among us knows exactly what's going to happen? The issue is, I was able to move during that pandemic, unlike some of the people that we were working with at the time, because I have 5 or 6 different residence permits. And in most of the cases, the terms were easier for getting in for a resident. I have a handful of citizenships that, unless it's Australia, they're going to let you in. And there were times when I was getting those when I realized, hey, I just want as many options as possible. Who knows what will happen? I didn't know exactly why it'll come in handy. And so I think the same thing would happen if there was some kind of financial issue. I'm very diversified. Having that kind of setup. Now, you may not want to, open 40 bank accounts as I did at one point. Maybe 2 or 3 or 5 is enough. Maybe you put some gold somewhere else. There's lots of different little things you can do. Residence and citizenship for the geographical stuff. What we do is we help people create and execute holistic plans that speak to their own needs. Because you may be more concerned about, Justin Trudeau coming after your bank account than you are about a currency collapse. You may be more concerned about having a second passport so you can travel because you're like, hey, I'm stuck the last time this happened. We all have different things that we're concerned about. And, our approach at Nomad Capitalist is non-judgmental. I'll tell you what, if you're concerned about the zombie apocalypse, we're happy to help you figure out, I don't know how much we know about where the zombies are or aren't, but we can help you figure out what the plan is for that. Having options around the world makes you prepared for this kind of stuff. There are going to be more black swan events coming. They've been coming throughout history. And I think that this whole kind of multipolar, disjointed, chaotic order that's happening right now, I would imagine there's going to be more of them. The solution for me is being prepared years in advance rather than a day too late.